We are going to mute the chat today. And we're just going to go ahead and record this session, and we're just going to take it from there. So I do apologize that we won't be taking your questions today, but hopefully we will post this live later on so that you can still see the questions that we're asking our guests and the discussion that we have today. So like many of you, I'd like to welcome you here first to Nerdy Shop Talk. Like many of you, both Julie and I have found that some of our most valuable learning happens when we're just talking with others, other learning designers, other people in this industry, and just talking about new trends, issues, and challenges that we have. These might be hallway conversations at conferences or email exchanges, chats on Facebook, LinkedIn, web calls, all sorts of places. And if you've ever wanted to eavesdrop in on these conversations and experience what some of those learning designers, what their knowledge is, Nerdy Shop Talk is that video cast where we're going to give you that opportunity. I'll introduce you to our co-host. Julie Dirksen is an instructional designer and the author of the book Design for How People Learn, which is one of the best-selling instructional design books available. A lot of people have it as a textbook, actually. She is a respected international speaker and instructor and has been recognized as a guild master by the e-learning guild.
And my co-host is Tracy Parrish, who's just one of those people who kind of gets things done. She's an educational technology specialist and can do all the parts, instructional design, project management, and development. And she's a frequent speaker at industry events and an articulate community hero, a moderator of Learn Chat, and creates this fantastic list of free learning resources at her website. And to get into the topic, it's a question mark about whether this is indeed the least sexy ID topic ever, but it's an interesting one to me because I think one of the big crucial things that we struggle with sometimes is being able to define correct performance. And sometimes that's an issue of, a stakeholder asking for something that's maybe a little vague, or it may be a matter of, circumstances or situations where it is actually just genuinely difficult to define correct performance because there's so much variability in the system or so much variability in the environment. And so I just want to briefly introduce our guest today. We've got Guy Wallace, who I think of as one of the great old school IDs in our field. If that's a fair introduction, Guy.
A gray beard, so yeah, I'm old school.
I think I'm right there. I'm right there with you. Although I think you've got a few years on me too, but I feel like I've been around for a while. You're somebody who I think of as being really cognizant of kind of the history and the foundations and the underpinnings of what we do and kind of where a lot of it came from and things like that. And then we also have Dave Ferguson, who, I don't know, Dave, I feel like I've known you forever on the Twitters and things like that. I mean, it's not technically forever, but I think you were one of the people I interacted with early who's also been in instructional design for a long time and had your Dave's Whiteboard blog was one of the ones that I remember reading early on too, and really, think of somebody who likes to kind of figure out the how and why of things and, understand the details behind what we're doing. So delighted to have you both here, even though we're having an interesting day in the Zoom, but and apologies to everybody if you are viewing. We had some problems with Zoom bombers, so we've closed out the chat and the audio and all of those kinds of fun things. So we're going to have a nice conversation. If you want to, put some stuff later on, pass on some questions to us later on, we can always do follow up after the fact too. But Tracy, you want to throw out the warm-up question?
Unmute myself here. So wanted to just start with something about what is, maybe you told us beforehand, Dave, and you can, maybe you'll have something different here, but what's something else that you're really nerdy about besides sort of the e-learning and learning world?
Well, that's a broad topic, and I'm not sure that's a surprise topic, but there's a lot of things that interest me just out of sheer curiosity. So I guess one of them for me is languages. And it's kind of odd because I really speak 1.7 languages. So I'm pretty good at English. When I was in school, people didn't learn foreign languages in grade school very often. So it wasn't until I got to high school that I had any possibility of another language except for learning Latin when I was an altar boy, and that was not really useful as a communication tool. So one of the things I'm fascinated by the fact that you can have communication in another channel with a whole other structure. And I also find that even within the learning world, it's fun to use analogies like in Scottish Gaelic, which is a language I'm familiar with. There's no word for no. There's no word for yes. And there's no verb for to have.
Oh, interesting.
And I like to use that just as a upsetting people's paradigms. Turns out there's lots of languages with elements like that in them, but that's just the way Scottish Gaelic works. It doesn't mean you can't convey the concept of no, but it doesn't work in the way that your monolingual English framework prepares you for.
Interesting.
And so that's like 0.05 of the languages I know about. I can sing in Gaelic, but I can't speak it. And I know a tiny bit of Finnish, which is even more fun because Finnish is not even Indo-European. It's a whole other language family. And for example, the same way that Latin nouns and adjectives have the 5 declensions, Finnish has 15.
Jeez.
Nice. Okay.
Well,
Guy,
that's the thing I like. You know?
yeah. Nice. Nice. Okay, Guy, how about you? What's something besides L&D that you're nerdy about?
I guess the closest thing would be I love inland lake boating. I grew up as a boater. My father had a boat when I was younger, but I lived in the Chicago suburbs for a long time. There's no good place to do the kind of boating I like. Lake Michigan is like an ocean, and I spent 3 years in the Navy, and I'm done with that kind of boating. So I like inland lake boating, and I bought my first boat. I'm on my third now, but I bought my first one back in 2005 when I moved to North Carolina. And I've lived on 2 different lakes. And now I don't live on a lake, but I've got my third boat. And but I've had a terrible summer, and it was in the shop most of the time. And but anyway,
all right,
that's my story.
Okay. So the first question we kind of had was just, what's your sort of wackiest ever stakeholder request? What's the stakeholder request that you're like, holy cow, what do we even do with that one? So we've all got some interesting ones, I'm sure, but
well, I have one from this was a large client training project that was going to be instructor-led training for over 2,500 people. All those people were coming in for like 5 days of classroom hands-on training, and mostly it was to learn a new application that was going to be the core of their business. And they had not been computer users before. So they're brand new. They'd never used computers except a dumb terminal, and now they're going to get laptops and they have to learn to operate them, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the list of things, I wanted them to learn a little bit about, I wanted to learn about word processing, and they wanted to learn about spreadsheets and a couple other things, you know, one of those as long as they're here things. So I asked the client representative, well, what do you want them to learn about Excel? And he said, everything.
And in half an hour.
Oh, well, we looked at the tentative schedule, and we had a little over 2 hours for those applications. I said, well, you know, what do you want? What do you think we can get done in the 2 hours? He said, as much as you can.
oh, jeez. Yep. Yep.
Now, look, I could go on and tell what we did, but I don't want to. I want Guy to have his chance too. So you guys drive it.
Well, my story is that I was doing work with Alcoa Laboratories in the northeast part of Pittsburgh, the suburbs, and I had done a curriculum architecture design for the lab, the laboratory. And it was for the scientists and for the engineers and for the administrative staff. And we take kind of a performance orientation to this. But my client came to me after that project was over with and said, how would you go about doing a training session for new technology, something we've not embraced yet. So we don't really have a master performer for it. I said, so who's the target audience? Well, it's all the scientists and engineers at the lab. And then it'll be the people out at the plants where Alcoa makes, product. And I said, so what's the nature of what you want to address? And they said, well, we want to teach our people about creating an alumina ingot suspended mid-air and held up and in place by magnetism. And I said,
Wow.
whoa, okay.
Okay.
I could hardly imagine that, but I've been in the facilities and I'd seen how they cast an ingot before. And I said, so you don't have any master performers? And they said, no, we don't. And I said, do you have any subject matter experts that know a lot about this? No, they don't. I said, well, where does this idea come from? And he said, some professor in Scotland. I said, well, that's your master performer. And that's who you would have to engage in order to extract the information necessary for scientists and engineers to create a process for them doing this first in the labs and then out in the facilities. Anyway, that was a wacky one. And I don't know what they did with that, but I looked it up today and there were people that were doing this back in the 70s, maybe not with alumina, but anyway, so I think they may have gone ahead and done that, but I don't know.
Yes.
Well, that brings up a good point. So where do you start to narrow things, define things with your stakeholders? Do you have a process? Do you have a way that you could tell people that this is a good starting point?
Dave?
Well, I think in my experience, in a lot of the projects that I've worked on, I'm not necessarily dealing with people at a very high decision-making level. I'm kind of at the implementation of things for frontline people. So I can't, confront some vice presidential level person. The second thing I would say there is then I find that most clients will get confused by a lot of training and development jargon and processes because they are not interested, like the client I was talking about, they weren't really interested in sound education theory. What they were interested in was salespeople who could do their work with the tools the company was providing. And so I go back to two questions I learned from Joe Harless. Joe said more than once, don't ever ask your client, what do you want people to know? And the reason you don't want to ask clients what do you want your people to know is they'll tell you. And they will tell you, we want them to know theory of widgets and great moments in widget history and famous widgets of the past and issues. And this is true. Everyone in this podcast has had that happen. I sat in a session with a telephone company, not a Bell subsidiary, but a Bell-like subsidiary, in a 1.5-hour class that included half an hour explaining to people the step-by-step electronic phone switch. That's the thing you see in 1950s era movies when they're trying to trace the call and you see all the little mechanical switches going back and forth. And I asked the instructor afterward, why do you do that? Do you have a lot of these? No, we haven't had any of those for 20 years. But it's good for them to know how the step-by-step switch worked. It was not related to the job at all. So the question that Harless suggested, and it's a real good one that clients can understand, is what do you want people to do? And there's two dimensions to the do, and this is an important one. One dimension of the do is what do you want them acting on? What do you want them performing? That's their behavior. But also the do is really shorthand for what do you want to get done? And I will ask the client essentially, when everybody goes home, after they've accomplished whatever you want to have accomplished, what do you have? What can you point to? And we can work from that to figure out what do we need for these people who can't do this thing so that when they go home, you've got spreadsheets that report their sales. You've got an ingot that floats in the air or whatever the heck it is that you want. That's, to approach that systematically is good, but that's a lot better than saying, well, we don't have really a sound instructional objective. They don't want to hear that.
So I'm a big fan of the late Joe Harless as well. And I remember in 1985, he was really tired of hearing at a conference, that everybody should push back, not be an order taker. And he was presenting to a large group. I don't know if it was a keynote or what it was, but he said, and when your client asks you for some training, don't say in your whiniest voice, "Are you sure it's a training problem?" He said, "Say yes, and I can help you even more if I can do this thing called front-end analysis," or something to that effect. And I guess when I get approached by clients and they want me to address a topic, my goal is to flip a topic into a task. So, but the first thing I ask them is I, do my best active listening and repeat back whatever they told me about the topic and whatever they've said so that they know that I'm tracking with them. And then I ask about the target audience. Who is the target audience? Who is it that you want this for? And then I try to shift into, so what would practice look like? What would authentic practice look like for this target audience or audiences? What is it that we would, have them prove that they've learned it by doing things in the classroom or the training or however it's the mode of delivery. And so that's how I try to flip them to thinking about what does that application look like? What are the tasks that people would perform? What are the outputs they would produce? What could we do in instruction that would be authentic enough because we may not be able to do the whole process because of time limits or safety issues or whatever. So what is it that we would simulate in a practice and feedback session and try to get their mind thinking about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I know that you, you mentioned earlier the whole question of the master performer. How do you distinguish between a subject matter expert and a master performer?
I did this, and I worked for Motorola back in 81 and 82, and I was given a subject matter expert, and it said it on his business card, purchasing corporate subject matter expert. And I was purchasing course, and the pilot session bombed totally. And I found out on the day that I read out the results of the pilot session to my 30 manufacturing manager clients, they said, well, it's because so-and-so John he hasn't been out in the field for 7 years. He's up there at headquarters with you. And so I tried to talk about exemplars, Tom Gilbert's term exemplars for it kind of, and they said they hated the word. And I said, how about master performers? So I've learned to ask for people who were doing the job to a level of mastery the day before I met them. Not somebody who knows a lot about it, but somebody who does the job. Now, there's a time for going beyond master performers, if you will, or whatever you need to call them, star performers, exemplars, whatever, and to get other subject matter experts, because sometimes the client may think that, well, they may know how to do the job, but they don't understand the regulations, and we worry about that. So we may need some subject matter expertise from the regulatory or law department or some other group who can give us a more holistic picture of what are the tasks and the outputs, and what do you have to know to be able to do that and still comply with, company policies and procedures, external laws, regulations, and codes, or whatever that may be. So there's a time and a place to go beyond people who actually have proven how to do the job to people who have deeper knowledge in certain aspects about the performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and with master performers, I know one of the issues that always crops up with that is this whole question of how good are they at being introspective about what they're doing? Because so much of it's become automated. I don't know, maybe Dave has some ideas on this one too, but the whole issue of if you are talking to somebody at a high level of expertise, how do you get the stuff out of them that they have stopped thinking about because they've been doing this for so many years?
I think that's an excellent point, and I wanted to go back to the two points. I think I agree completely with Guy. Guy and I are pretty much in agreement. There's a lot of value from people like Tom Gilbert. So I will use the term exemplary performer, and one of the key elements of that, there are two key elements to me. One is that they're currently doing the job, and two is that they're generally recognized, not just by their boss, because that's how you get Steve, that the boss likes, designated as exemplary performer. But if you asked around, yes, Sonia really knows this stuff. You know, she's good, she gets stuff done, blah, blah, blah. So at my 5 years, 6 years ago, whatever it was, I came and took a new job in the pension administration field, not a field I knew a lot about. And it's very, very complex. And so I ended up working with basically staffers who've been specialized in some job or another. And one of my tasks is to because can be kind of joking at times, say that I get paid to say, I don't understand that. Can you explain it to me again? But then in addition, I'm systematic in how I try and frame my questions, sketch it out, check back with them. Am I getting this flow? Am I getting that flow? And learning to say, let's take the simple path. If everything goes well, when somebody is terminating their pension contributions, which means they're stopping paying, but they're not going to collect and they're not going to take their money out. There's a process to handle that. So later on, they come back and they get their partial pension. Take me through how that works when nothing goes wrong. And I learned that step. Then I can go back and say, so what happens if later on they change their mind? What happens this? What happens that? And you start getting a cascade. And my experience is that many exemplars, when they see that you're approaching a problem systematically, you're going to loop back and catch something that they think you ought to know, or you show where it fits into what you're doing. Then they see this person is systematic, perhaps not in the way that I would be, but they're catching on. And I was able often, we would find in one case, like 65 different factors, and this is not an exaggeration, 65 different factors related to some pension issue. Then work with them to clump them together into cases. So we can cover 8 of those 65 factors in this case that's got 2 parts. And they say, yeah, that makes sense. It looks, in guys' terms, it looks authentic. This is the way cases look when they come in. We can build with that. And they would thank me for basically helping to reorganize for newcomers things that they were good at.
Mhm. Well, how often do you, both of you, how often do you find that you need to have a really deep understanding of a topic? Especially if it's something very technical like that. Like I find with a lot of the clinical based courses that I create, which is almost everything, I find that my level of unexpertise has helped me to just sort of work through it and find those spots. Would anybody understand this? I have not, I got to this point and I don't know what you're talking about here. If I don't know, does your audience know? And sometimes they'll go, oh yes, they 100% will know what that word is, what that technology is, how to do that. And other times I'm catching them going, oh, right, we should have explained that. So do you dive down that deep? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You almost, I think in a lot of fields, you have to. You know, I didn't know anything about pension administration before I came here. Previous stuff I've worked on has been like vendor managed inventory, hotel reservation systems, pharmaceutical packaging, you know, and every field has got some kind of specialized language or specialized concepts. Some are easy for people to understand, some are not. If I talk about contributory service versus pension service, pensionable service, that means nothing to you unless you've worked in the pension industry. But our employees, after 3 weeks on the job, they know what that is, so they have no problem with that. And so I think the outsider view where you're not sure about something, coupled with, you know, go back to what we're talking about. If you start with what you want people to accomplish, that's the what. The next thing in any kind of training is who's the who? And you've got groups of who's. Am I adding some new feature to what already trained people know about? That's different from, am I figuring out how to onboard brand new people in this same area? And then what's the when? When's the trigger for this task or cluster of things to begin? You start putting those together and you're at the same, one sense, you're putting a fence around the topic and the subject matter expert recognizes that, okay, within this fence, here's how we can go. and they come up with something else and you ask if it fits inside the fence or not. No, no, that's really outside. Okay, I get that. It's like the parking lot.
Mhm.
I plead ignorance at the beginning of the project and throughout the project so that I can either play dumb or it's actually not E playing, it's just the actuality. So choosing master performers, what I do when I get a client is that I encourage them to form a project steering team of the client and the other key stakeholders. Maybe it's the vice presidential level or whatever. As a consultant, I'm normally brought into things that are, pretty important, have high stakes, high risk, high rewards associated with the effort. And so my clients sometimes do that, most of the time do it, in fact, but sometimes they don't. And then that kind of hurts the project because then they got to implement something and they need those people that would have been on the project steering team to help them with the implementation, but they're not on board with the whole thing. But when I get a team of the stakeholders together, I ask them to identify the master performers, the people we want the target audience to begin to emulate. So who's the best of the best? If you give me, good stuff in, good stuff out, garbage in, garbage out, this is, an investment in taking your best people out of the workflow, out of the performance environment and have them work on this. And I would want them for an analysis team and a design team, and then on the development effort as well. So that's how I choose the master performers. And what I've seen is that people sitting around the table will call on somebody and say, "Hey, I'm giving my best person here. I don't think you've done that here." And so it's a little peer pressure that I try to employ with the stakeholders because they have something at stake. And if I can make a reasonable case about what we're going to do with these people, why this would be a valuable investment, so short-term pain for long-term pain. But then when we get with the master performers, and it's everybody, it's the experts, it's the not ever, so much knowledge is automated. Dr. Richard E. Clark, Dick Clark, has done studies and done research on this, and he has a process called cognitive task analysis. And the intent of this is to extract from experts that he's worked with or anybody that you would work with, because 70%, up to 70% of knowledge for decision-making has been automated. So at best, any one individual can tell you 30% of what a novice would need in order to be able to perform on the job. And so this is huge. A lot of us work with one subject matter expert, and that means at best we can get 30% of what a novice performer will need, which is going to cause them to need to go do informal learning, trial and error, or social learning after the fact, because what they were given instructionally, a learning experience, isn't going to be close enough, full enough to 100%. So his methodology is to go work with individuals one at a time, and you work with 5, and after that you get diminishing returns because every expert knows a different 30%. So if you talk to enough of them, you're going to build up closer to 85% of what the novice would need. So my methodology, my approach to instructional design, going back to 1979, is I like to form groups of these master performers, other subject matter experts, sometimes managers and supervisors of the target audience because they have a different perspective, and some novice performers who have maybe been in the job for 6 months. And when I'm dealing with a project steering team, I'm asking them, these master performers that you've identified, how long have they been in the job? If they've been in the job for 20, 30 years, then they're not going to have a clue as to what it's like for a new person coming in. So perhaps we need to bring in some novice performers, some people with some experience who can go toe to toe with wizened old master performers. Now, who do you got? And then they can talk about the pros and cons of doing that, whether that makes sense to them. And a lot of times it does make sense to them because they can see that, oh yeah, this group that we've picked, they're going to have an old school approach to this thing here. And we've got a different kind of target audience coming new into the job. And so you're trying to get that balance of a team effort, a collaborative effort here, what I call a facilitated group process, and then run them through the analysis. But so regarding this stuff that gets automated, too often I think in our profession, we try to do all of our analysis up front, every last thing. It's akin to what the quality movement in the 70s and 80s called boiling the ocean for a cup of tea. We try to get everything that we may need. And I've seen so many analysis documents where 90% of the information in there didn't get used in design and development. So it was overkill in the extreme. And so I like to do enough analysis to frame the performance and identify the enabling knowledge and skills. And then when I go into design, I add to that analysis data. So I'm doing analysis in the design effort. And I save the nuanced, the cognitive tasks that are going to remain harder to get until I get into development when I know I really need them. And then what we're trying to do then is figure out what's the covert thinking that happens along with the overt behaviors, because we can see and count the behaviors, but we can't see and count the thinking that goes along with that. So now it's a matter of asking the kinds of questions of the expert that once you've got them and you narrow this down to this set of tasks for this output. So what do you think before and during and after you do that first task? And same thing when you're doing the second task and the third task and fourth task or whatever it takes to get to the final output. And that begins to get them thinking about this. And then I do alpha testing of my content and beta testing of my content. And then I go into a full destructive pilot test. And all the time you're adding to your analysis data and layering in, embellishing it with more and more insights in terms of, what are the thinking that has to go along with the doing. Sorry, it's a long answer.
That's all right.
So I'm actually,
I just wanted to, if I can jump in, I wanted to go back to Tracy's example of the clinical kinds of things that she deals with, because as we've been talking, we haven't addressed this quite directly, but there's the kind of knowledge that's very easy, or not easy, the kind of thing where there's only one or a limited number of correct answers. This is what complex learning in 10 steps, which you may recall I've written a line or two about. This is what they call recurrent tasks. And a simple example is, how do I do stuff in Excel? Not what do I apply it to, but if I'm going to do a pivot table, or if I'm going to do lookups or whatever the hell, there aren't that many ways to do that. So there is definitely either one correct answer or like 5 correct ways to go, or 5 acceptable ways to go about doing that. Then you have all kinds of other behavior for which there is no definitive correct answer. What's good customer service?
Mhm.
What's good diagnostic behavior for a clinician at the ER, et cetera, et cetera. And when you don't have that, then the information you need to help people acquire that is different. You can't just give them 10 principles of negotiation and have a successful negotiation. That's not going to happen, because what they need to do is have something that looks like a negotiation on whatever scale and an objective, and struggle through that, and then take a look, and maybe they diagnose it with a partner, or maybe they diagnose it with a coach and say, was this a outstanding effort, and why? Was this an acceptable one? It's an okay, it's a C- negotiation, and this is why it's a C-, because there's no, even when you've got your exemplars, you may have a range of opinion on the exemplars, but ideally the 3 exemplars would look and say, you know what, that's not the way I would do that, but that is an acceptable way to handle patient intake in this kind of situation. So I think that's an important thing to recognize, that there's these 2 broad areas of performance that don't get learned the same way, and so can't possibly get taught the same way. But you'll have clients, especially senior client management, more removed from the job, less interested in nuance, is going to want to just, well, let's just give them all this information. And you're going to have performers who want that. Engineers, just give me a bunch of facts and I'm fine. No, that's not sufficient for this. Sorry about that, but I wanted that to get in before we moved on.
No. And I think you're actually, anticipating kind of where we want to go with this. I do want to come back to this question of places where performance is harder to find. So, I think your examples are great. Negotiation, diagnostics. You had another one.
Customer service, just in
Customer
general.
service, sure. But actually, I want to leap back just for a second before we jump back into that topic. Guy, you mentioned alpha, beta, and pilot testing. Can you talk a little bit more about the process that you do with that? Because I think that's a really interesting area. I think that's a big gap that I see in a lot of places is we're not testing stuff. We're not like trying it out, So what do you actually do when you do those things? And then we'll come back to the point that Dave raised.
Yeah, so when I'm planning projects, I usually give people 3 drafts to get ready for a pilot test session. I've taken the pilot testing efforts out of the development phase, if you will, because I always wanted to make a big deal with it about my clients and say, that's what we're gearing to. We're going to do this on this date, whatever. We're going to pilot test it as authentically as we can in the intended way it's to be deployed or accessed afterwards. But so you create the first, so if you have a design, and I have a fairly detailed and rigorous design approach, a bunch of templates, and you take your analysis data and populate them, and then you embellish them and add to that, and then you get that approved by the client, then you go to develop that content. So I develop, I already have my objectives by develop the application exercises first, any demonstrations second, and then the information that makes sense so that you give people information, then you show them the demonstration, then you put them in the application exercise. So I once you've got the first draft of that, you take that to somebody to review, and you generally take it to the people that gave you that information to make sure that you got what they told you correct. And you hope they see, oh, there's things that I could have added or I should have added to that, and you massage that and add to it a little bit. Then you update that and get ready for a beta test, which you can call these things anything that you want. This is just the language that I learned way back when. But the beta test is then you take it to additional master performers and other subject matter experts and review it with them, thoroughly review it with them. And you're not looking at the whole module or the course or whatever. You're looking at just the piece part that you developed. And you get more eyes on it and more reactions, and you can review this in a group, small group, or one-on-one with people, or send it to them and get their feedback from them one way or another. But the goal is to find the holes. So I'm always going for content that's accurate, complete, and appropriate. Accuracy is usually not an issue. Getting it complete is the big issue. Getting it appropriate is less of an issue also. But so getting it complete. So I'm always looking to add to, because I'm pretty darn sure that I don't have it all. And I knew this before I learned about, the cognitive task analysis and non-conscious knowledge and all of that. I just knew, because you could see as you do your development that people are always wanting to add to it. And other people go, oh yeah, sure. That's, of course, that should have been there. And so the beta test is that you update after the beta test. And then what I tell my clients is I like to go for a full destructive pilot test. We're going to take all the content and package it and do the very first delivery or make it accessible, however. And then we're going to do a lot of evaluation around that, which means if we're going to take something that's a 2-hour module, it might take 3 hours to do it, because we're going to be intervening at certain points to find out, is this accurate and complete? And is it appropriate? And getting reactions from people before they forget it. So you don't wait till you're done with the 2-hour module and ask them what was missing, because they might have forgotten it by that point. But that's the approach that I use. And when I have what we would call the lesson from Hades, it's hellacious, then we by design in our plan, we're going to go through 5 iterations of that before we take it to pilot, because it's got problems for some reason, a known reason. And when I point this out to my clients, they go, oh yeah, that's going to be a tougher one here. So that's going to go through 5 iterations before we go do the pilot test on it. And the goal, of course, is to make sure that we get it as complete as possible, so we can prepare the learner to go back to the job and perform the requirements of the job.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's really kind of at that last stage that you're actually, getting kind of user feedback and things like that.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, and you might take it to the novice performers too, the target audience members. Usually they're in the pilot session. but not in the alpha and beta test. But you can mix that up any way you want to see if does this make sense to people? Because to experts, yeah, that makes sense. Of course it makes sense. But to a novice person who has not learned it yet, you got to see, does this resonate with them? Can they understand it, to some of the points that Dave brought up?
Mhm.
Right, right. Do you often get really different feedback from users than you do from experts? Like, how is that, or is it, what's sort of the difference between the stuff that you hear from those different audiences?
If I can, so when I talk to my project steering team about doing the pilot testing, I tell them I want two distinct audiences. I want the target audience that doesn't know this already.
Mm-hmm.
I need to measure learning, do a pre-test, do a post-test or whatever. Sometimes they want to do that, sometimes they don't. And to see, can we cause learning to occur here? And then we'll hope that it transfers out to the job and put in things to help make sure that happens and have an impact, because we're targeting performance. But they can't tell me, the target audience can't tell me, is this accurate, complete, or appropriate? They don't know. So I want master performers and other subject matter experts involved in that pilot test. And I can't measure learning with them because they already know it theoretically, not always, but that's the theory. They can tell us though, is it accurate or not? Is it complete or not? And how to make it better. And is it appropriate? And those are just the earmarks that I use to decide, do I have it good enough to actually deploy or to make it accessible to the target audience? Or do we need to, do another round of updates and pilot testing and all of that? But that's you do get different feedback from people. And to the experts, they may say, this makes a lot of sense. And to the new people, you can find out that they don't understand the vocabulary. They don't understand some of the key words in here. And so, we're going to have to put more content in here to explain some way, make sure that they are prepared for this, either pre-event, before they get to the main event, or there's many ways to approach that. And those are typically business decisions that the clients need to be involved in making. How are we going to prepare the people for this?
Sure. Okay, so to loop back to what Dave was talking about, scenarios, and I think I'm really interested in this one right now, because I think that there are definitely places where, people have this acquired expertise, but a lot of this stuff is subtle, right? Like, it's instances where the the right answer is it depends, or instances where there's just a lot of like the negotiation kind of thing, or the diagnostics, or the customer service, all of this kind of stuff. So David, I don't know if you had anything to add on that, others we can see what I
was going to say, sometimes it's like you don't remember the answer to that scenario until that scenario comes up again. And it's a very specialized answer, very specialized scenario, but it's like, until the blue light bulb blows out, I forget that there's a way to specially handle a blue light bulb as opposed to all the rest of them. Sorry to interrupt there, Dave.
Yeah. Well, there's a cluster of things going on there. So one of them is going to the blue light issue. If the blue light goes out on average once every 6 months, you are not going to train most people to memory in how to respond to blue light.
Right.
There are some exceptions to that, and I like this example a lot. Flight 1549, the Sullenberger plane that landed in the Hudson River. I read an interview with Sullenberger, and of course, the first officer, Skiles, was flying the plane at the time they hit the birds. Sullenberger said whatever the equivalent of is my plane, which means I'm taking over flying. And he said afterward, he had more hours flying this particular aircraft than Skiles did. So in his judgment, because he had a lot of the pilot training, and pilot training focuses on emergencies, he was the better choice to do that. And everybody remembers Sullenberger doing this. At the same time, Skiles was using the checklist to restart engines in flight. And the judgment there was, that's a huge, it's a big job aid. It's 3 pages long. I've seen it. And the purpose of the job aid is to, 1, avoid tunnel vision, and 2, step someone through a difficult process that doesn't happen very much. So Sullenberger's judgment was that Skiles had just come back from his recurrent training. He had a better idea of what the current organization of the book full of manuals was. And the best thing he could be doing at the time was trying to restart the engines, because they didn't know if that was possible. But it'd be really good if they did start. There's another checklist for landing in the water. They decided not to bother with that one. It would be better to try and get the engine started. Sullenberger felt that his training was sufficient for him. I mean, this is after the fact. It was sufficient for him to take care of that part. So it's, there's some skills that you're not going to be able to train around. Going back to the sources of information, where can I find the information to take care of this? If there's something dire that happens, I have a child, going back to the hospital thing, when one of my children was born, they do a thing called an APGAR score. It's a scale 1 to 10 for newborn babies. Rose's APGAR score was 1.
Oof.
She was born with the cord wrapped around her neck. So the respiration was bad, the heartbeat was bad, blah, 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 blah. They had a code pink team for newborns, like a code blue. So they coded her, and 5 minutes later, her APGAR score was 8. Well, the things they do during that, they're not looking up no job aid on how to respond. They've got a team trained regularly for these outstanding things.
Well, but I think it's interesting that the 2 examples you picked are flight safety and healthcare, right? And both scenarios where people, if they do it wrong, people die. And I think that those are the places where they've been exhaustive about what does somebody need to do in what circumstance, right? Like, I think those are whenever I talk about this, those are the 2 primary examples I use, right? And, if you learn to fly a plane, 80 years ago, most of these checklists didn't exist. And you'd go up and you'd fly with an experienced pilot, and you'd kind of get a feel for it, and you'd practice some scenarios and things like that. But they didn't have flight simulators, and they didn't have all of these checklists. And so you learned a lot of it by feel. But they did all the heavy lifting to take a lot of these tacit things and make them explicit things.
Yeah.
So when you get something where there's a lot of tacit, so I think the negotiation is a good example. I think diagnosis is probably a little bit more of a, like closer to that line, although there's art. Anything where we start to talk about there being art and science to something is probably something where there's a decent number of tacit skills. So Guy's nodding, so I'm going to let him talk about this.
Well, yeah. So I think that, complex performance is chock full of the tacit knowledge, and it's just not obvious, and people have automated that. And so that's really tricky. I mean, this is not easy. This is why doing analysis and continuing analysis when you get into design and development is really critical. So part of this is, most complex performance is not rote. It's not the same thing all the time. It's chock full of variation. There's variation in the performance context, and people need to understand what a master performer, I think, understands is, what are you on the lookout for? Before you start doing something, are you surveilling the request, the requirements for this instance of this performance? And are you looking at the other variables, the people, the infrastructure, the tools, the materials, the data, and all of that to see, do you have what you need? But have the requirements changed for some reason? The customer wants something, or you're going to have to do a workaround. So how, getting out from people what they have to think about before, and then during, and then after the performance, to make sure that they're ready to go on to the next steps is really difficult. And that's where this, a cognitive task analysis approach or whatever is required. So I start, once I understand what are the behavioral tasks that people have to do, I want to know. So let's go back to the first one, or first set. And so what are the discriminations you need to make? And that's just my word, that you can change this language all you want, but what discriminations do you make about the situation, the environment, the performance context? And then what determinations can you make about what are your alternatives? I can go left, I can go right, I can go straight forward into this thing. And, now I've got to make a decision as to what's the best route in doing this performance, because, and I get a clue of this when master performers tell me how to do something and somebody says, well, I don't do it that way. I do it this other way. And they go, well, that would work too. All right, so there's many routes to the output. And so maybe there's a time and a place for one versus another, and that's what you've got to tease out. So you've got to give people the time and the space to tell you how they do it, and have the other people react to how somebody else did it and whether they would do some of it the same or some of it different. And that gives you a clue of the variances that the performance tolerates, because not everything has to be done exactly the same way. And then it's a question, and this is what some people try to avoid, because now we got 5 different ways to do this. Well, how are we going to teach the learner? I ask the master performers, because I've got them in a facilitated group process in a room, and I ask them, so which way do we start the novice? And then when and where do we teach these alternative approaches? Because they need to understand, how to perform, how to avoid the barriers to performance, which is part of the situations, I think. And if the barriers were unavoidable, how do they recover as quickly as possible, as effectively and efficiently as possible? So, and that usually allows me to get into a discussion with them about, what does the performance context demand? Does it demand a memorized performance response? Because since day one in the business back in August of 1979, I was told we were going to do job aids. We're going to turn everything into job aids, but our clients hated that, so we had to embed job aids in training. But we can't, we too often expect people to memorize everything. So what does the performance context, when it demands a memorized performance response and everything else, does the context allow a referenced performance response for a job aid or performance support or whatever label you want to put on that?
Are those your 2 levels? So like the referenced versus the memorized, or is there something else?
Well, that's how I kind of frame it. So if the performance context allows you to reference things most of the time, but there's that rare occasion where you have to memorize it, that just automatically shifts back to that's got to be memorized.
Okay.
Question of, does the job itself reinforce that memorized content, that knowledge and skill, every day, all day long? Or is that something you do every once in a blue moon? We're going to need spaced learning to, it's like why fire people are practicing firefighting all of the time, because there's things that come up and they've got to be prepared for that. So we can't just say, okay, we're going to give it to you in a job aid, or we're going to train you on that. Now, some things that are trained on that are going to have to be memorized are reinforced by the job itself all the time, often enough. And other things, you can't count on that. So you're going to have to put in some other mechanism to, reinforce, refresh, space that learning out so that people don't, you're trying to fend off the forgetting curve.
I would go back to the 2 points there, and I like Julie's little gesture like this. I tend to think of those, if I make a binary distinction between, I call it training to memory, which is what learning is, when I'm talking about job aids. And I only use that to make a distinction between 2. So I've got training to memory, and I've got an external reference. But some stuff you can put into external reference format, and your job aid, you've got to decide, is my job aid a guardrail or is it training wheels?
Yeah.
Because I can take a lot of material that's too overwhelming for somebody entering this, put it in job aid format, but I know because of the frequency of their performance or the usefulness of it or whatever, if they're doing it 6 times a week, after a month, they're not going to be relying on a job aid, and I need to be then clear, is that good or not? I may need some system that says, no, we don't want you trying to remember these steps because they're going to change from time to time. The job aid's in an online setup. If it changes, we're going to change that job aid. So we want you looking there. We don't want you remembering what the reduction factor is. Go check that. That's good. We need to reinforce that behavior. We need to make sure that coworkers and supervisors are reinforcing that behavior. And we got to make sure it's not really slowing down things, with some other conflicting demands about time. And customer service in a call center measured against call time.
Right.
No, and I've always loved that training rules versus guardrails. Analogy. I think I can put that in the book maybe, but yeah, I've always liked that one because I think that's a really useful distinction too.
There's a really critical example, at the risk of going back to airline safety, of a crash that occurred in a private jet run by for a business, when it turned out that the pilot and co-pilot involved 90% of the time were not completing the pre-flight checklist.
Oh, yeah.
They thought they knew what they were doing, presumably, because they had certainly had a certain stake in getting this done right.
Mhm.
But it seems to me, I don't mean to make light of it, but they had misused, in my mind, their tool. They decided I didn't need to go through the checklist, and the mechanical failure, so to speak, on the aircraft, I use that term loosely, the failure in the aircraft that led directly to the crash was one of the items that you would have been checking if you'd gone through the checklist thoroughly, and they weren't.
Yeah. This is such core kind of bread and butter stuff that I think, like, being able to do some of this stuff well. And I feel like I've got other things we could talk about, but we should probably get wrapped up pretty close to, because we're kind of at the top of the hour.
This has been, this has actually been my favorite part of this entire work week. So I thank you both so much. We kind of jokingly said that this was the least sexy topic in ID, but it feels like we could go on for like several hours more on this. But we'll just wrap up with the question: what would be an even less sexy ID topic? What do you think, Guy?
What's something that you feel like is just a neglected thing, but nobody thinks it's sexy, but it's really kind of a core important thing that people need to be better about doing?
Well, I think it's two things, actually: detailed project planning, and then use and placement of logos in the materials. Those are the two least sexy things here. But I think the first one is really critical, that doing the detailed project planning. I feel that's really critical. But the
Perfect.
whole notion of, logos and things like that, that's a client preference and a template kind of a thing.
All right, we're signing you up for that episode. Perfect. Okay. And what about you, Dave?
Well, I want to touch on the logo thing once. I worked for GE in a training capacity for 18 years, and I am possibly proudest of the fact that I managed not to have the GE meatball, the logo, on every page of any training thing I did. I just ignored it. It's a waste of real estate. We're doing internal training for GE people.
We know where we work.
Yeah, they know where they are. Blah blah. I can't think of anything that strikes me as extremely boring off the top, except that one of my pet interests, of course, is job aid design. And I think job aids in general get very short shrift in the learning and development world in general. They get even more short shrift now that everything is supposed to be online. And so, there's a tendency in the learning and development world, and I'm certainly guilty of it, to tell people things and explain people things. And if we explain it well and tell it well, that's going to happen. And so we end up with endless amounts of live training or online training, synchronous training, async training, doesn't matter, where we're telling people things that could have been on a handout, and we're not giving people guidance for their jobs that would embed the knowledge in something that they could learn to use, make that an essential part of the training, put it on the job, faster to update, faster to redistribute, easier to get involved, even with the shortcomings there. But there's no excitement in that, because at the bottom line, there's a bias. Oh, they had to look it up. So rather than look it up, we want them to know the 144 different agreements under which you can transfer pension benefits with another pension plan.
Well, perfect. We found two. We snuck out of two more topics out of you both. I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us this week. Julie, you have any wrap-up comments there?
Oh, it's like we didn't even get into questions, which we clearly don't have time to do, but we didn't even get into the questions where like the technical expertise is unlearnable for you as an instructional designer, which I think is an interesting one. So that might be my vote for some kind of, future conversation about it. Because yeah, that's and I do think there's lots of interesting stuff on these tacit skills and kind of case examples and stuff. So clearly this is a topic that warms my nerdy heart, and thank you guys for so much for joining us on it. So thank you also for your patience around our technical hiccup early on. I heard from a few people who would have come and joined us, except we had the room locked down for a bit, which probably wasn't a terrible choice, but at the same time meant that a few people who did want to come didn't manage to make it. But we will make this recording available, and I'm sure we can figure out a follow-up sometime. So thanks,
For sure.
thanks everybody.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much, everyone. Take care.
Bye.